Hello, everyone. My name is Murali Chakinala. I'm a pulmonologist at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, and I'm director of the Pulmonary Hypertension Care Center at Washington University in Barnes-Jewish Hospital. It is truly a pleasure to be here today, and I really want to give a shout out to the whole PH community. Today is obviously a very special day, being World PH Day, and I hope everybody's doing well. It's also Cinco de Mayo, and it's a gorgeous spring day in St. Louis, but I'm really excited to be here indoors talking to you guys for the next 30 minutes. I have a deep interest in pulmonary hypertension. I've been doing this for almost 20 years now, and part of the joy of being a pulmonary hypertension doctor has been to be involved in all the clinical research and clinical trials that have taken place in the last 2 decades. This is truly a remarkable area of medicine in general for a rare disease with so few patients, to be involved in so much research and have an opportunity to really bring some treatments available to patients and really make a difference in people's lives. It's a tremendous opportunity, and it certainly wouldn't have been possible if it wasn't for the efforts and contributions of all the PH patients out there. And I want to use these next few minutes to talk about this and take your questions about clinical trials and clinical research in pulmonary hypertension. And while I'm waiting for any questions to come along, let me just say a few introductory comments about clinical trials and clinical research. We know we wouldn't be here, we as a PH community, especially our patients, if it wasn't for the therapies that are now available. And we wouldn't have these therapies if we wouldn't have done the clinical research. This is a very closely scrutinized area in our country, as patient safety is paramount to everybody. We can't just come up with an idea and say, hey, this drug could work. I even did some stuff in my lab and it seems to help in these in vitro or preclinical models. Let's just start giving this to patients. Well, it doesn't work that way in this country, and it really shouldn't, because many great ideas in the past have really gone nowhere or even wound up hurting patients. So we have to carefully investigate carefully investigate any treatments that are proposed and prove that not only are they safe, but they're effective, or what we often say, efficacious. And new therapies in pulmonary hypertension go through a sequence of trials from sometimes phase 1 or phase 2, where in phase 2 there's small trials, and really the first time patients with a condition like pulmonary hypertension are studied on a new treatment, and we try to determine the optimal dose and prove that it's safe, and there's enough of a treatment signal that we can move on to the next stage. And then phase 3 trials are the big ones. These are what we often call pivotal trials or registration trials, because now we are studying on a much grander scale, and we're really trying to prove that a new investigational therapy is better than a control or an established therapy, and it's this trial that really makes or breaks whether a medication might be approved by the Food and Drug Administration. And then we also have phase 4 trials, which are trials on drugs that have already been approved and are in use, but we're trying to learn more or expand our understanding of how a drug may work for a disease that it's already approved for. So companies and foundations have to go through these various stages in order to get a treatment approved. There are lots of benefits, I think, to doing clinical trials. It's interesting, some surveys have shown, mainly work coming out of the Pulmonary Hypertension Association registry, that the vast majority of PH patients would like to participate in clinical trials, but only a minority have actually been offered the chance to participate in a clinical trial. And why that is, it's hard to say, but the point is that there's a deep spirit and a sense of community out there that I think wants to participate and help develop new therapies. Being in a trial certainly could benefit you, the patient or the subject. You may get a chance to receive a new medicine that's not yet available, or may have access to medicines that are available but may not be affordable, and so it could directly benefit you. But really, the biggest reason I think to participate in a clinical trial is to help the community. You have a chance now to make a contribution to the rest of those PH patients out there and the future generations of PH patients. I would remind you that when you look at your medicine bottle and know that there's a treatment that you're taking, keep in mind that your predecessors did the same thing in order to get that medicine approved for you, and now you have a chance to participate in something to deepen our understanding of this disease and new treatments that could make the difference in the lives of future patients. So it's a classic example of paying it forward. Another thing I would say is that patients often worry about, well, what happens if I don't do well in a clinical trial? There's a lot of safety mechanisms in our country for clinical trials. You're closely watched by your local care team, the team that's entered you into the clinical trial, the sponsor of the trial, the human subjects committees at the home institutions where the trial is being done, and of course the study sponsor, as they certainly don't want anything to go wrong with their medication or investment. So I think there's a lot of safety steps or safety mechanisms in place to help prevent harm, or at least minimize harm as much as possible. So I've talked now for almost 7 minutes, and I want to really leave the rest of the time for any questions that you may have. So if you have questions, please type them in, and so the PH Aware can let me try to answer those. While I'm waiting for questions to pop up here, I'll keep going and talk a little bit more. Clinical trials in pulmonary hypertension have really evolved quite a bit. We used to do trials where we only needed a small number of patients, maybe 50, 60, or 100 patients, and we basically studied the investigational agent versus a placebo for a span of just 12 or 16 weeks, and could show that something like a 6-minute hall walk would really change. And that was enough to really convince us that something's working here and that we should go to the FDA and try to get this medication approved. Well, some of those kind of trials are still done nowadays, especially earlier phase trials, but really the bar has been raised in pulmonary hypertension, and the last few years we've seen a surge of trials that are much longer, where we really are trying to prove that on top of the therapies that are out there, patients have to get even better, and it's not as simple as just a 6-minute walk test that drives the decision. It's really something more deeper or harder to reach, like proving that we can maybe save lives, keep people out of the hospital, show that people are not progressing in their disease and needing to go on to more advanced therapies that people want to avoid, like an infusion or transplantation. So in order to meet this higher bar, our trials now go on much longer, 1 or 2 or even 3 years, where you're still in a clinical trial. And that has its pluses and minuses, and we have been successful in getting some medications approved this way, but it does take its toll. We need a lot more patients, and we need to follow them for a lot longer in a trial, so patients are tied up. And we really view every patient as a precious resource here, because PAH is such a rare disease, and we have many more trials to do even now, and more ideas to investigate. So if existing trials are going on so long, that patient gets shut out of other trials, because you really can't be in more than one trial at one time, because if anything goes wrong, it's hard to know which investigational agent might be the culprit, or if anything goes right, it's also hard to know which one is the one that really benefited you. So you can't be in more than one clinical trial at once generally. So it has made it tougher with these longer term trials. And I will tell you, we are on the cusp of an interesting new phase, I think, in pulmonary hypertension. I've been very excited to see that there are quite a few new agents and new companies that are beginning to get interested, or that have been interested and beginning to really get going with clinical trials. And we're really entering a period where we're going to have several phase 2 studies that are important to complete. And the reason why it's really, I think, important to start getting these going is that without success at the phase 2 level, we can't do the phase 3 level. And the other exciting thing is that several of these new studies that are going to be done in the next couple of years are in agents that work completely differently than what we currently have. They're not just another endothelin receptor antagonist or just another PD5 inhibitor or just another prostacyclin analog. And while we've come a long way with the therapies that we have, we certainly still have a long way to go in order to make this an even more treatable disease and maybe even eventually find a cure. So we need more than these 3 classes or 4 classes of therapy when you also include a soluble guanylate cyclase stimulator. And we are finally at a point where some new phase 2 studies are going to be done that will hopefully open the door for new pathways to be exploited in our field. So I think that's very exciting, and all the more reason why we really need your help, that if you at all can consider participating in a trial, that I would encourage you to do so. And if you haven't been asked by your doctor or your center, you take the first step and ask them, because sometimes physicians get very busy and we don't think about a specific trial for a specific patient, and it would be great if patients could come forth and say, doctor, I'm interested and I'm willing to participate, or can I learn more about what trials are out there? So I'd really encourage you to think about that as, if at all possible, and not to be afraid to at least consider the possibility. But the first question here is, are there any studies for twins, one with PH and one without? And that is a fantastic question. I'm not aware of any such studies right now, and typically these kind of studies are great for understanding mechanisms of disease and potentially gene and environmental interactions, and these are important areas in pulmonary hypertension, no doubt, and we're doing some studies to try to look into these, mainly registries. I think the part of the reason why we haven't had that come up is just that PAH is so rare. To find twins, or especially identical twins, would be just almost hard to believe or hard to fathom. I have another question from one of my dear patients about the implantable pump. And I know many of you out there are waiting patiently, people on infusion therapy. And what this is referring to is that we've been involved in the last few years in trying to develop a new implantable pump whereby the catheter and the pump are all under the skin or internal, as opposed to the current situation where you have a catheter that's partially external attached to a pump that's external and carried around all the time. Clearly, the external delivery system has its hang-ups, and so the idea of going to an internal system where you as a patient don't have to do anything at home except just be aware of alarms that you might hear is exciting and attractive. It is in the final stages of approval, we believe, and the best guess is that it's going to get its approval later this year and be commercially available sometime in 2019. I have a question, why does it take so long to, do clinical trials? And I kind of touched on this in my introduction. It's just these trials go through phases. It's not just looking for the perfect patient, but you have to find the right patient. And trials are geared to minimize harm and maximize the chance of success. So you have to wind up excluding a lot of patients based on other problems they have, or if they're too sick, or if they're too healthy. So you're trying to find that right sweet spot of types of patients and severity of patients. And when you're already dealing with a rare disease, you can imagine how long it takes then to find enough patients. But it also comes back to what I said earlier, that we've been so successful in so many therapies out there. It's not right or ethical to avoid treating patients with proven therapies just to put them in a clinical trial. So most of our patients now go into trials already on therapies, and they've already improved to a certain extent. So in order to improve beyond that, it's that much harder. And a related question, how long does it take for a new drug to make it all the way through to FDA? I'm going to answer it in the pH landscape, and right now you're looking at least 4 or 5 years to go through phase 2 and phase 3, if not longer. I have a question about where do I see pH over the next 2 to 5 years on new meds or new approaches to trials. Well, I think the new approaches to trial is something we're always looking at. We're always evolving our trials, and that'll continue to go forward. Again, we want to minimize risk, maximize chance of success, and maximize efficiency. What's the shortest and the smallest trial we can do to get to the answers we need? In terms of new therapies, I don't want to disappoint people, but I'm not sure there's going to be any major breakthroughs in terms of new therapies in the next 2 to 3 years. And that's because most of the trials going on right now are entering into phase, most of the drugs, or candidates I should say, are really entering into phase 2 with a couple of exceptions, but I think we're a little bit a ways from having another new pathway, a new therapy available. Do patients have to travel far, or do they typically participate locally? Generally, you participate locally, but there are some trials that are only being done in a few places, and if patients have the means and the motivation, the trial sites will certainly permit people that live farther away as long as they're able to make that commitment. What if I'm on meds already? Do I stop them when I start a new trial or add on to them? Well, great question. Generally, we have been adding on to what you're already taking. Although there is one trial right now that's going on called the Replace trial, which is the basis of the trial is to see if one therapy might do better than a different existing therapy that patients must have already been on. So you would go into the trial and come off the previous therapy and go on to a new therapy. But in general, we add to our existing therapies. What about stem cells? Anything new with this? This is a tough and exciting but somewhat disappointing area too, I would say. We've been hearing about stem cell research in pulmonary hypertension in one shape or form for a while, and the stuff that had gone the farthest are using something called progenitor cells, which are a little different than stem cells, and there has been some work in Canada and China done on this. I haven't seen anything come really forward with this, so I still think we're a long ways away from that coming to fruition, unfortunately. What are some misconceptions about trials that patients often ask? A question asked earlier, well, do I have to stop my other therapy? And I think I answered that. Not necessarily, and most often you don't. Other questions get asked is, what if I decide I don't want to keep doing the trial? Am I forced to continue? And of course you're not. At any point in participating in a clinical trial, you can stop. Generally like to have a good reason, and I would say your research team will try to convince you not to drop out prematurely, but it is always your prerogative to drop out of a trial if you don't want to. Cost is something else that often comes up too. Do I have to pay for my participation in a clinical trial? And the answer to that is generally no, especially when investigational agents and other investigational tests have to be done. Those are almost always covered by the sponsor of the trial or the research team. And sometimes, though, the course of a clinical trial, especially if you're dealing with a long trial, if other medical issues that come up that aren't related to the study, then your usual means of reimbursement or coverage for that kind of care should still fall on whoever your insurance carrier or your payer is. But people should understand, though, that participating in a clinical trial generally doesn't mean that you have to pay any more out of pocket. What's the easiest way to find a trial? Well, I think the easiest thing is to talk to your doctor, and hopefully if you're at a center that's involved in clinical research, they'll let you know. But if you're not in such a setting, and we know many of you are in smaller clinics or being cared for in the community and not going in an academic center, I suggest you using online resources. Clinicaltrials.gov is a wonderful website that's run by our government, and every clinical trial that's being done in our country, no matter what area, has to be registered on clinicaltrials.gov. Search pulmonary hypertension and you'll get a dozen trials, and you can pick and sit and see if anything to you. Word of mouth, PHA support groups, or patient friends, a lot of the chat rooms. There's so many ways to find out about trials. Another question asked, do patients get paid for trials? Yeah, generally they do. It's a hard to make all these extra visits and your time. So most of the multi-center trials, larger trials, sponsored trials, patients often get a stipend or something as reimbursement for travel expenses, and they're participating, which sometimes can be lengthy. Do they do trials for kids with PH or typically just adults? They absolutely do trials for kids, and this is really important because we don't like to think of the kids are just small adults. They're all, and that's proven to work and be safe for adults. You can't assume that's the case for children. And we need to do trials in kids. The problem has been kids, it's even more rare to have pulmonary hypertension, and it's just been very difficult, I think, to get a lot of trials done, and we often wind up going by small amounts of experience or little trials to show that we can use the therapy in children as well. But we definitely want to do trials in kids as well. Deal with placebos? Well, placebo patients or people who get randomized to placebo are really important to truly prove that a clinical trial is successful. We have in clinical research called clinical equipoise. We may have a hypothesis or a theory that something's going to work and be better than something else, but we have to have this idea, this attitude that we just don't know, and until we do the proper trial, we will never figure that out. And there's no better way to answer that than to give it the medication to one group of patients and give a placebo, which should do nothing for the patients, to the other group, and compare how outcomes and adverse effects in that first group versus the second. We generally, and the highest standard for trial is that neither the patients nor the researchers know who's getting the placebo and who's getting the active drug. We want maximal equipoise there, and we want the actual benefits and the effects of the medication to show through in the results, and it not be biased or tainted by what a patient may think and what an investigator may think. And I will tell you, after doing dozens of clinical trials, it is impressive that sometimes you're sure as a doctor or researcher, or the patient is sure that they were on placebo, they were on an active agent because they feel better and do better. And guess what? We find out at the end of the trial, they were actually on placebo. So it is hard to, it may be hard for you to believe, but it happens all the time. And this is why we really need a placebo, and we need to be blinded to what a treatment assignment a patient or someone is in. I think those are all the questions. I, again, apologize for the hiccup there along the way. Again, I want to thank all of you for joining me. I want to wish you all a fantastic World pH Day. And again, I want to say that I'm aware that I'm rare. Thank you.